Thank you for having me today and taking the time to listen to me speak to the subject of wild bees in a time of global change. My name is Jonathan Koch, and I'm a research entomologist at the United States Department of Agriculture Agricultural Research Service Pollinating Insects Research Unit in Logan, Utah. 4,000 years ago, my ancestors left their ancestral homeland of Taiwan to sail the Pacific in search of a new place to call home. Now imagine you are standing at the front of the canoe, feeling the wind waft over your body and the sun gently reminding you of the night drawing near. You are intently scanning the horizon, excited yet nervous about the prospects and uncertainty that lie ahead of you. You may have some reasonable reservations, but you are confident in your abilities, you have experience, and you have a dependable community on board. Yes, there will be unexpected challenges and storms along the way, but you are navigating with purpose, with a clear goal in mind. Now, of course, today I'm not going to talk to you about the fate of my ancestors on their voyage, but rather use it as an illustration to discuss how we, as a community of scientists and stakeholders, might navigate wild bee management and conservation in the face of global change. Now, I do want to emphasize that in order for us to achieve effective management and conservation of wild bees, we need to carefully think about the research questions that we ask, how we choose to disseminate the research, and how we will work together as a community of scientists and stakeholders. When many people, particularly non-entomologists, think about bees, they think of a bee like a honeybee or a bumblebee. However, as many of you are well aware, globally there are more than 20,000 described bee species. These bees come in a diversity of shapes, colors, and sizes. The more than 20,000 bee species are distributed across 7 bee families. Bees are nearly ubiquitous, occurring on every continent except Antarctica. Wherever there are insect-pollinated flowering plants, forests, farms, cities, and wildlands, there are bound to be bees. Now, how are bees impacted by global change? Well, to answer that question, we need to clarify the definition of global change. It is a term widely used to describe the effects of human activities on Earth, and today we will treat the term similarly to the ecosystem panel of the National Research Council, in which they use global change as the interactions between natural changes in Earth's physical and biological structure and the broader effects of human activity. How does global change impact bees? Well, like much of biodiversity on our planet is experiencing, the effects of global change on bees are decline. Patterns of bee decline include population decline and range shifts that lead to decreased richness diversity and ultimately reduced pollination services. This is concerning given the value of wild bees in sustaining our global agricultural systems. For example, Garibaldi and their authors in 2013 report that wild insects, including wild bees, pollinated crops more effectively. In fact, an increase in wild insect visitation enhanced fruit set by twice as much as an equivalent increase in honeybee visitation. For the remainder of my talk, I will briefly identify what wild bees need, and 2, review case studies on the impact on wild bees by global change. And then finally, how can we as a scientific community move forward to produce research that supports effective management and conservation decisions? Now, as many of you again are aware, most bees need floral resources of diverse nature and of course diverse nesting habitat, depending on the bee of interest. Of course, we do know that some bees have unique requirements such as unique overwintering habitat, as well as if they happen to be a kleptoparasite, let's say, a suitable host. And I'm sure you can think of a variety of unique needs for the types of bees that you study. And for the remainder, in no particular order, I will cover at least one case study associated with one of the following global change factors contributing to bee decline. That include climate change, landscape change, pesticides, disease, and invasive species. Let's start with climate change. A study by Miller Strutman and her co-authors in 2015 found that total food resources for alpine bumblebees on Pennsylvania Mountain and Colorado have fallen by 60% since the 1970s. On the map before you, you can see the red shaded area where that decline of resources occurred. Because of this shift in available floral resources, the authors suggested that the alpine bumblebees experience rapid evolutionary change in the length of their proboscis or tongues due to the decline of floral resources. So when the authors compared historic specimens of Bombus balteatus and Bombus sylvicola to contemporary specimens of either species, they found a marked and significant decrease in their proboscis or tongue length. In addition to climate change, rapid landscape change, primarily the conversion of wildlands to agriculture or urban lands, is found to reduce pollinator species richness. For example, Grixey and their co-authors in 2009 found a decrease in bumblebee richness in Illinois, likely due to intense landscape change. On the map before you, you can see that the dominant color there is gold, and that gold is representing agricultural lands. Of course, the negative effects of land use change is not exclusive to bumblebees, which happens to be the insect that I like to study. In fact, visitors to one species of Claytonia virginica flowering plant in Illinois decreased over the course of 120 years. In fact, compared to studies in 1916 and 1971, Burkle and their co-authors found in 2000 and 2010 that 50% of bee species were extirpated from a similar research environment. In fact, the authors also found significantly less pollen on the body of bees over time when they compared historic collections of bees compared to contemporary collections. They found a significant reduction in the proportion of Claytonia virginica pollen grains on the bee bodies, ultimately cascading to reduced pollination services. In addition to climate and land use change, we are starting to see the real impacts of pesticides on wild bee communities. In June 2013, the application of dinotefuran in a suburban shopping mall in parking lot in Wilsonville, Oregon, provoked the largest documented pesticide kill of bumblebees in North America. Based on GIS and population genetic analyses, we estimated that at least 58,800 bumblebees, representing between 289 and 596 colonies, were killed during this single pesticide event. To our knowledge, the documentation and impact of pesticide kills on wild populations of beneficial insects has not been widely reported in the scientific literature. Given the Wilsonville case, it is likely that the majority of mass pesticide kills of beneficial insects due to pesticide misuse go unreported and unnoticed. While I was a Master of Science student at Utah State University more than a decade ago, I collaborated on a study led by Sidney Cameron and co-authors on the extent of bumblebee decline in North America. And we compared a variety of hypotheses associated with bumblebee decline, and one of them happened to be the hypothesis that declining bumblebee species, as indicated by red on this particular figure before you, had a higher disease prevalence than stable species, as indicated by the gold star before you on this figure. And in fact, we did find there were significant differences in this particular pathogen of Nosema bombi within the guts of these insects. In fact, some species like Bombus affidus and Bombus terricola were so rare that we didn't get adequate samples for a robust analysis. And finally, I would like to close on this particular global change impact, and that is of invasive species. In Hawaii, where I did my previous research, we found that the number of non-native bee species established on the islands has doubled since the 1970s. So the most isolated archipelago on the planet has a massive amount and an increase of non-native bees arriving on the shores and has doubled since the 1970s. These non-native species are primarily found at a low elevation, below 500 meters. So this figure you see before you has on the x-axis species richness, or the number of species, and on the y-axis elevation. And we have two climate scenarios we're examining, a contemporary climate scenario versus future climate scenarios in the 1970s. And we see that across time, we expect that most species will stay well below 500 meters in Hawaii, which could ultimately impact the native species, some of which are endangered in the similar environment. Like my ancestors, who depended on their community to successfully navigate the ocean to find a new home, we as scientists and stakeholders have a clear and tall order of challenges ahead of us. We are beginning to have mounting evidence that some species may likely be already extinct. For example, Bombus franklini, or Franklin bumblebee, has not been detected in the Mount Ashland area of Oregon since 2006. Thus, it is clear to me, as a scientist who's been in this field for over a decade, that the success in navigating wild bee research that informs management and conservation is dependent on collaborating with a community of stakeholders and scientists through authentic engagement. So how do we move forward in research and education? For the next couple of moments, I will identify approaches that aim to bridge research with contemporary gaps in education and results dissemination. For example, No Mow May is a community science initiative popularized in recent years that encourages property owners to limit their lawn mowing practices during the month of May. The goal of No Mow May is to provide early season foraging resources for pollinators that emerge in the spring, especially in urban landscapes when few floral resources are available. Del Toro and Ribbons, in their recent study, found that No Mow May homes in Appleton, Wisconsin, had 3 times higher bee richness and 5 times higher bee abundances than frequently mowed green spaces. Furthermore, there is still much to live and learn to help our communities understand what wild bees even are. For example, Van Viersen Tripp et al. Polled 2,000 people in Canada on bee research, bee taxonomy and bee issues, and they found that 50% of Canadians thought that European honeybees were a native species to North America. Thus, there is quite a bit of work to do for us to educate the public on what wild bees are and, of course, what wild bees need. One way we can achieve this communication is through clear presentation of significant research. So by attending the Entomological Society of America meetings and participating as a presenter at all career levels will help us sharpen our speaking skills. We can also develop novel ways and unique approaches to presenting graphical representations of our research and our results. Finally, in order to move forward in research and education on wild bees, we need to pursue diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just collaboration. We need to think about collaborating with diverse stakeholders and scientists, perhaps even create a think tank of researchers interested in the question and with shared interest in research, and create a space for diverse researchers and stakeholders. In conclusion, by ensuring the health and requirements of wild bees, we can ultimately ensure human health and high environmental quality. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention during my seminar, and I'm happy to answer any questions.